Salut! Hi guys, welcome to the fourth video in the Beating the Micros series. Hopefully you had a chance to check out the fourth article, which was discussing fold equity. We looked at some of the basic maths behind steal attempts, and also how fold equity plays a role in post-flop decisions. Hopefully, as you look back over some of the old hands you've played, you can then use the basic formula for expected value that we looked at to help you decide whether you think you've played the hands in the most profitable way. Today we are going to be reviewing a session I played a little while ago, back in March. Sometimes it's interesting to look back at a session where you don't necessarily remember how the action went with various hands. Sometimes if you review a session that you've literally just finished playing or played the other day, perhaps you can be influenced by some of the thought processes as you were playing those hands. Whereas if we look back at an older session, we can perhaps take a more objective view of whether we think we played the hand in the most profitable way. You may also find that you did various things that you wouldn't even consider doing, because even over just a few months your game can change, sometimes quite drastically, and I definitely think my game has quite possibly changed since I played this session. So it will be interesting to see what I think of my play from a few months back. The first hand, we have pocket aces under the gun. The session was a mixture of 10NL and 25NL. This hand was 25NL. We open raise to 5x, which is fine. And the big blind, who is playing 8110, calls. I don't necessarily know exactly which stats I had on this player when I played this hand. I probably didn't have 79 hands. That was probably as I finished the session with him. It's possible I knew he was likely to be a fish, and he most definitely is playing 8110. The flop comes ace 4-9, and the big blind donk bets for under half pot. There are two options on this flop. We could definitely raise, seeing as we have such a strong hand, and hope that maybe he can peel us with maybe a 9x, 4x, some types of pocket pairs. Maybe he can have an ace-x hand himself, but obviously there is only one ace left in the deck. The downside to raising here is just the fact that there aren't many hands he can continue with. We pretty much have the board locked up here. We aren't too scared of him sucking out. There are no straight draws. If he has a lower set, he's pretty much drawing dead. Even if he has a pair, he is in very bad shape. There is pretty much no hand we are scared of here, and we don't necessarily want him to fold on the flop. In fact, we definitely don't. These things considered, I think probably the best play is flatting here. I just think we are never going to get any action if we raise this flop. Although he is an 8110, I don't know how much I knew about him as I played this hand, but he can still possibly continue here to a raise slightly wider than you would expect most people to. I do flat, which I think is probably the best option. He then bets the turn for $1 into a 460 pot. And I have heard recently that this is considered a bet sizing tell, and it's quite possible that when a player makes their bet sizing the same on two streets, for example, he bet $1 on the flop, he bets $1 on the turn, he's obviously not thinking about betting a percentage of pot size. I've heard it said this is actually a tell that his hand strength has not improved and therefore hasn't hit that 6 of spades. However, it does coordinate the board. There are now some draws out there. There is some flush draws. There are several straight draws. It's definitely fine to put in a raise here. I think my standard play is probably to raise it to maybe around 320. Let's see. I make it $3, which I think is fine, and hope he calls. The river is a 4, which is obviously a completely safe card for us. We have pretty much the nut still. Our main concern should be going for value. Obviously, it would be nice if he hits that 4 sometimes. He can have some 4s in his range, given how he plays. He decides to donk the river for half pot, and I do think it's quite possible he has a hand that he doesn't want to fold. He can definitely have a 4. If he has a 4, I don't expect him to be folding a 4. I think the best play is probably to raise for value. Maybe shoving all in is a little bit ambitious, and a slightly smaller raise may allow him to make a crying call with some 1-pair type hands, which he shouldn't really ever be calling with, but if he's a bad player, you may as well give him the opportunity. I raised to $15, I think that's fine, and he folds. So it's likely he was bluffing the river, perhaps with some of his missed draws, perhaps if he had a spade draw, or perhaps a hand like 5-7. He's obviously missed his draw that he had on the turn, and wants to fire the river and hope to take it down. I'm quite happy with how I played that hand. Next hand, again we have pocket aces from the cutoff. We open raise to 4x, quite standard, and we get 3-bet by the player in the small blind. He has been playing 36-15. Again, with these stats, I don't necessarily know which stats I had at the time, but assuming I had a reasonable idea of these stats, one thing to note is his 3-bet percentage is very low. It is 2.4%. From the small blind, however, his 3-bet percent is 8% out of 36 hands, which would equate to 3 out of 36 attempts. Therefore, even though he has been 3-betting slightly wider from the small blind, he is still 3-betting very tight. I think he probably has a reasonable strong hand here most of the time. I don't think he's necessarily going to be folding to a 4-bet. I think my preferred option here is to 4-bet for value, which I do. The 4-bet sizing is fine. Perhaps it may even be on the small side. It's okay though. We could think about making it slightly larger, but it's fine. He 5-bets, almost a min 5-bet. At this point, it seems highly likely that he has kings, or at the very least he has queens or ace-king. I do think his most likely hand is kings here. We're obviously just going to shove over the top for value, and yes, he has pocket kings. So not much to that hand, pretty much a cooler. Next hand we have ace-queen suited from under the gun. We make it 4x. It's useful to notice this table is in fact 5-handed, so we are effectively opening from middle position. And the player in the cutoff shoves, and I do have a note on him. It says check raise flop with weak top pair. I think, given that he is short stacked, he is sitting at 40 big blinds, and also this doesn't really make too much sense with pretty much any hand. Important in making these decisions is the game dynamic at the time. For example, if he has just shoved the last two hands, you can expect him to be a lot lighter here regardless of the stats. In general though, for 40 big blinds, unless you suspect someone is playing very tight, and I probably had no reason to suspect this guy was playing tight, a hand like ace queen suited is pretty much the nuts for 40 big blinds, and I make the call, which I think is fine. And he shows jacks, so we're pretty much flipping, and I get there on the river. Either way, it's pretty much a coin flip situation. Given the money I've invested, it was correct to make the call if I knew he had pocket jacks. Next hand, we have pocket tens in the small blind. The button, who is Jojo, the player we played the first hand against the pocket aces, who's playing 81-10, he open limps the button. I definitely want to raise here for value. Yes, I'm out of position. No need to raise too big, I don't think. I doubt he's folding anyway, given how he plays. So there's no need to make a huge pot out of position. I think a 4x ISO raise is fine, and he calls. Again, we flop top set, so we are running good against this player. Again, we have the board locked up. I think I do prefer betting. The downside to betting is there aren't really too many hands he can call with. However, he does have a tendency to call too much, and this is a flop that we haven't hit too often either. I think you can do either here. You can check and hope to trap here, but coming out and betting's fine. It's just that there aren't really any draws. You're really looking to get value from maybe overcards or a worse one pair type hands like pocket eights or maybe a 5x or a 3x. Seems I check, which I do think's fine. Against this type of player, yes, you are missing potential value on the flop, but this is the kind of player where you can still sometimes get the money in on turn and rivers by making huge overbets, or you can check raise shove on them. So just because you have way more than a pot size bet left on turn and rivers, that doesn't mean the money is not going in just because you didn't bet the flop. Betting's fine, you just have too much fold equity. Checking's also fine in the hope of trapping. I think probably my standard is to bet, given I think this player quite possibly has a tendency to call too wide. Therefore, if I was playing this hand now, I think I would bet the flop. But checking is fine. When the turn comes a 7 of spades, it obviously coordinates the board. There's plenty of hands he can now call with that he may have been folding on the flop. Anything with a flush draw. He may even have some 2-pair hands now, given how wide his range is. Although I think he's calling most 1-pair hands on the flop anyway. He can have some straight draws as well. I think the turn should really be a standard bet. I'd probably make about 175. And it seems that I check here as well. I don't really like this. I think the best option is to bet here, because if the turn goes check-check, then you probably are not going to get stacks in. I don't think checking's horrible. I'm probably planning to check raise if he bets. I'm not too sure what I was thinking at the time. Maybe I figured he is going to fire this turn with anything that has potential. He's going to fire with any spade draw, any straight draw, definitely any 2-pair. And therefore he is going to call a check raise with these hands, because he doesn't necessarily realize that I'm very strong if I check raise this turn. I definitely prefer betting the turn. However, again, against this player, There still is the possibility that you can get the stacks in on the river, even though it's a huge overbet, just because I don't think this player is very good. For example, if he has a hand like Ace-3, perhaps, which he's checking back, because he doesn't think it's strong enough to bet. If he was to spike an ace and hit 2-pair, even if I jam all in on the river, I think he's going to have a tough time folding. Therefore, checking the turn is not too terrible. I definitely prefer betting though. And he checks back, which is not great. I do finally decide to lead the river, and I do make it an overbet, which is okay, I suppose. I definitely want to try and make up for the fact that I've lost so much value with the way I played this hand. I definitely can't check the river as well. And he ends up calling and showing Jack-5. Perhaps on this river, with a hand like Jack-5, if we had bet smaller, he may even have raised. I do, however, think we still need to bet big on the river. It's possible on the flop and turn he is also not folding a hand like a pair of 5s. The bottom line is I don't really like the way I played this hand at all. I definitely prefer to bet the flop most of the time. If I don't bet the flop, I definitely want to bet turn and river. I guess I was just thinking at the time that this guy is so bad that the stacks can literally go in at any time. It doesn't matter that there's only a couple of dollars in the pot. All the stacks can still go in on the river if he hits a hand he liked. And in some ways I'm surprised that more money didn't go in when he hits his second pair on the river. He may have been deterred slightly by my overbet. So that's one hand. Looking back, I'm not really that happy with how I played. Pocket queens. Under the gun, open raises. I've discussed this at some length in the previous videos. Under the gun looks like a regular. There's really no need to be 3-betting a hand like pocket queens here. It looks very strong. The regular is probably only going to continue with a range which you don't do so well against. Best option here is to flat, which I do. We do get squeezed by someone who is sitting at just over 20 big blinds. Given his stack size, I definitely think I'm committed with a hand like queens. However, he hasn't been 3-betting very much. His 3-bet is only at 2.4%, so I do expect him to have a hand here. I don't think he's ever shoving any random trash. I think he likely has a pocket pair or an ace-x type of hand. However, given the stack sizes and given the money that's already in the pot, if the under the gun player does fold, I definitely am just going to get the money in. I don't think he's ever folding here. And he has the ace king, so which is fine. We're a slight favourite. It's more or less a coin flip. And we hold up, which is nice. But given his stack size, I definitely think that's pretty standard. The next hand, pocket queens from the cutoff. We definitely are going to be open raising this. We make it 4x, which is fine. The small blind, who is playing 36-23, makes the call. And the big blind, who is playing 33-16, makes the call also. It's interesting to note that neither of these players have a full stack. They are both slightly under 100 big blinds. It seems perhaps they don't have the auto rebuy option enabled. It might suggest they are slightly weaker players. The flop comes 6-5-8. It's not really a great flop for our hand, but we should definitely bet for value. There are plenty of draws that can call. There are worse overpairs that can call. If we do get check raised on this flop, we are in a very tricky spot. We are hoping they flat, or one of them flats. Both of them flatting is not necessarily great for us, because while we have okay equity against one of them, our equity against their combined ranges isn't that great, although we do get better odds, obviously. The turn comes a king, which is not a great card, seeing as it's an overcard to our queens. I don't necessarily expect them to have a King X type hand that often in terms of overcard hands, so if they have a hand like a naked King Queen, I don't think they are necessarily going to be calling this flop. There are, however, a reasonable amount of King X's they could have that are part of perhaps flush draws. They might have a King X of spade type hand, or they might have perhaps something like a suited King 7 for the straight draw also. But who knows, perhaps they are capable of calling on the flop with some King X type hands. When this player leads out for $6, I think it's probably a fold. I think it's quite likely he has hit that king when he leads out, because I think any of his 7x type hands, or any of his other straight draw hands, or any of his flush draws are not donking here into two players. I think his most likely holding is probably some type of King X. Maybe he has a King X of spades, in which case we are obviously in not great shape at all. I think this is probably just a fold. It seems as well that this player is not overly aggressive. We make the fold. This player calls, and then he jams the river. His most likely hand is probably a flush draw that got there. He probably has the spades. And this player folds, which means he probably didn't have the spades himself. In fact, he definitely didn't have the spades. He probably just had some kind of King X type hand. Unless he was semi-bluffing a diamond draw on the turn, which is possible. Either way, I think we made the right decision to fold on the turn. So I'm reasonably happy with how I played that hand. 6-7 suited from the small blind. The cutoff open raises. The button calls, and it's Jojo again. He's playing 81-10. It seems we do make the call here. I don't think it's a terrible call. I think my standard these days is either to fold the 7-6 suited here, or if I think there are suitable players in the cutoff and button, I can definitely make a squeeze attempt to bluff. I don't necessarily like flatting as much here. Suited connectors don't necessarily play that well out of position. They will play okay in multi-way pots, and this is why I definitely used to call in these situations. I'd think, well, the pot's already three-way, and if the big blind tags along as well, since he's now getting great odds to call, then I'm seeing a multi-way pot with my 7-6 suited, perhaps four-way, which, yes, is a reasonably good situation. It's just that it's going to be difficult to play out of position against three people. Therefore, I do not think this call is terrible. I just think that folding is a slightly better option. Folding or squeezing, and I definitely don't think squeezing is a good idea, given the button is probably not going to fold, and at the end of the day we have 7 high against a player that possibly is not going to be folding a lot post flop. Therefore, I think in this spot I prefer just folding. We do flop the flush draw. I think my best option is to check call. If the board was drier, we could choose to donk our low flush draw, but on a 10 jack ace, I think there are plenty of hands that are not folding. Any lone queen may call here, or any lone king. any ace is probably not folding. There are also better flush draws and some 2-pair combo type hands like 10-jack, ace-10, ace-jack. I definitely think our best option is to check call. On slightly drier boards, I do often prefer leading the weaker flush draws and then perhaps check calling the nutted draws like the ace-x flush draws. I prefer to check call. The reason being is obviously if you have a flush draw like 7-6 suited, there are better flush draws out there. The cutoff does make a c-bet. The player on the button calls, as we'd expect, with pretty much most of his range. We're getting good odds, and we have reasonable equity. The only time we don't really have good equity is if someone has a higher flush draw. We make the call, and we do hit on the turn. I think the best option at this stage is to lead. There are value hands that either of these players could have. Any king isn't going to want to fold. It's possible they can make crying calls with some of their 2-pair type hands, like 10-queen, jack-queen, ace-queen, ace-jack. However, these hands are not necessarily betting, given that the flush has got there on the turn. I do decide to check, and I think my reasoning was that they will bet a lot of these hands. But in actual fact, looking back on this hand, I don't think they're necessarily even betting a king x here. If the river's a non-spade, they may bet their king x's on the river, but I think checking here is definitely not a great play. I much prefer leading this turn. I think they're going to have a tough time folding a straight or 2-pair or any set maybe if they had a set, although it's quite possible Jojo would be raising a set on the flop, and the cutoff could still have a set type hand, which would be very difficult to fold, especially seeing as he does have outs against a flush and a straight. In general, though, I think probably the most of the hands that are not flushes are not going to bet this turn, and therefore I should definitely lead because they may well be calling this turn. I don't like my play here. After choosing to check the turn, I think maybe checking the river isn't as bad. It's unlikely they're going to put me on a flush, and they can still value bet a king x type hand. Although perhaps leading the river still better. If I could play this hand again, I would definitely just lead turn and river for value. And this player had ace queen, and this is the type of hand that typifies the reason why I should bet. You can't really value bet a hand like ace queen. He can't value bet it on the turn because any king, someone has a straight, and any 2 spades, someone has a flush, and the same situation occurs on the river. He cannot value bet this hand because he's only going to get called by better hands. He can, however, call with this hand, the reason being, while a lot of someone's betting range may include king x type hands and flush draw type hands, they can also include bluffs, and pretty much ace queen beats all people's bluffs. So this is a hand that can perhaps call turns and rivers but can't value bet, and there are a lot of hands that fall into this category. For example, any 2-pair on this board, and there are quite a few combos, any set, and to some extent any king x, depending on their playing style. Some people may bet the king x for value on the turn, they may bet the king x for value on the river, but not necessarily with 3 spades out there. So there are so many hands that fall into this category of perhaps being able to call 1 or 2 streets but can't bet for value, and so I think I should definitely fire turn and river. I don't like how I've played this hand. I think a lot of it is to do with the player in the button. I think the most likely thing going through my head at the time is that this player is probably capable of making some spewy raises and things, and so I can still get the money in on a later street. Looking back, I don't like how I played the hand. Moving on, we have the 10 jack offsuit. We open raise from the cutoff, which is fine. It's a little on the looser side, it's definitely fine. Especially given that there is a 49-5 in the blinds. We do flop top pair, and against this type of opponent, I'm definitely looking to get 2 streets of value at least, possibly even 3. I make it $1 on the flop, which is fine, and he calls. The ace is not a good card for getting value necessarily. It's true he may have hit that ace himself. I think it's less likely, given that he called on a 10-7-2 board with a flush draw. It's true he could have some ace-x hands in his range. If he had an ace-x of spades, he definitely is calling the flop. I think I should bet again on this turn, however. He can still call with any of his draws, 8-9, 9-jack for gut shot, 6-8 for gut shot. Any flush draw he can call again with. He can maybe even call again with a 7x or a worse 10x. These hands are less likely to call, however, now that the ace has hit the turn. So the reason this ace isn't a great card is not because he may have an ace, it's because we now have more fold equity against a lot of his worst one pair hands, and we don't necessarily want a lot of fold equity when we are trying to get value. We should definitely fire this turn again though. I think I would maybe bet around 240. Definitely want to get reasonable value from any of his draws, and I make it 225, which is fine, and he calls. The river comes a 9. I don't think this is a great card. It does coordinate with some of his range. Obviously it completes the 8-jack, which is only one type of hand, we're not too worried, but he can have things like 10-9, perhaps he can even have a hand like 9-7 suited. Therefore, I think going for value on this river is going to be a little thin. I do think we still have the best hand reasonably often. I just don't think he's necessarily calling with worse enough for us to value bet here. We don't want to be isolating ourselves against a range that beats us on this river by making a value bet that's too thin. He's also obviously not going to be calling again with any of his busted draws unless they also have a pair, which a lot of them do, such as 8-9 for example. 9-jack now has a pair. We could therefore consider making a very small river value bet. I do decide to check back, which I think is fine. If the board had run out in a slightly different way, if the turn and river had been bricks, we definitely may have got 3 streets of value from a worse 10 or a 7x or a hand like pocket 8s. Given how the board's run out, I think checking back the river is fine. Seems this hand was heads up. I open min raise the button, which I think's fine for heads up play. For a while the standard was to make 3x raises heads up. The advantage of making a min raise is it's easier to call a 3-bet, and if they're folding too much you get a better price on a steal. Also it sets up a slightly different stack to pot ratio post flop. The more stack sizes remaining for playing after the flop, the more skill is involved. The player in the blind calls, And the flop is king 10-6 with a flush draw. I don't think I necessarily have a lot of fold equity on this board. I'm not sure which stats I had on this player, but it seems my overall stats indicate he folded once out of three c-bet attempts. I think there are also plenty of hands he can call with on this board. There are many hands with a draw, plenty of gutshot hands and open-enders like Jack Queen. There are also 10x hands, King X hands, flush draw hands. I don't think I'm necessarily going to get many folds on this board. I think I prefer checking back. I do end up betting, which is okay. In a heads-up situation, if you have an ace-high hand, it's likely to be the best hand, even after you see the flop. In my mind, however, this is a good reason to take a pot control line and check back the flop, and maybe you can even call some turns and rivers if you think it's likely he's bluffing. The problem with this line is, while it does give us a shot to take the pot down on the flop, I don't necessarily think he is folding the flop that often, and we are also bloating the pot. It's going to be much harder for us to call any turn or river bets with that ace-high type hand when he does decide to donk bet, if he does. So betting the flop's okay. I think I definitely prefer checking back. I do decide to check back the turn. My goal really is just to get to showdown against a hand like Jack Queen, Ace Jack, 9 Jack. He bets the river for pot size. I think the best option here is just to fold. Perhaps some of the time you can make an argument for calling. When he does bet pot size here, you have to ask yourself, well, which hands can he bet pot size with? Is he betting pot size with a king? It's possible he doesn't. It's possible he only bets pot size with a hand like 10x, or a hand like 8-9 for the straight. He can also bet pot size with any of his bluffs, like Jack Queen, Ace Jack, 9 Jack. Basically, what I'm saying is that this pot size bet polarizes his range to an extent. Maybe not completely. Perhaps he can bet a King X or pot size on the river. I think at the time I must have felt that he was polarized, and therefore this kind of bet pretty much means a 10x, or maybe an 8-9, or it means a bluff, and therefore I decided to make the call with ace high. I don't think it's terrible by any means, and it turns out he did have the 10x, so it's possible my read was correct, that he plays a 10x this way. I really just don't know. The question is, does he do this with a hand like Jack Queen, or does he just check the river to us if he has a busted draw? And seeing as I don't know the answer to this question, perhaps the best play on the river is just to fold, but calling here is definitely not terrible. 10 Jack suited on the button. We open raise to 3x. I'm not sure what stats I had on this player at the time, but given his overall stats, so far he has a 3-bet of 14.3% over 73 hands. Also looking at his specific 3-bet from the small blind stats, he has been 3-betting 38% out of 8. So that's about three attempts out of 8. 3 out of 8 possibilities. He has 3-bet 3 times. Even with this small amount of information, I definitely think, given the hand should flop well, although we don't necessarily expect him to be flatting a 4-bet. In fact, the actual potential of a hand only really matters if he's ever going to flat a 4-bet, because if we do 4-bet and he 5-bet jams, it doesn't matter if we have Jack 10 suited here or Jack 2 suited, we are pretty much folding. If you don't necessarily know someone's tendencies and you think it's possible they might flat a 4-bet, then it's always going to be slightly better to have a hand like Jack 10 suited in your 4-bet bluffing range than it is to have Jack deuce suited. But if you think they're going to 5-bet or fold the majority of the time, it doesn't actually make a difference whether you have Jack 10 suited or Jack deuce suited, because you are folding to the 5-bet. The decision here really depends on the dynamic and how many times he's 3-bet up to this point. This may have been the first time he 3-bets, in which case folding is fine. If I had this amount of information, which is only 73 hands, but it's enough to maybe guess that he is possibly 3-betting light from the small blind versus button open, and I definitely would make a 4-bet here. It turns out I do make the 4-bet, and he jams, and this is just going to be a standard fold from this point, but I think the play is definitely fine. 5-6 suited from middle position, we are 5-handed. I do make an open min raise, which is something I remember I was experimenting with at the time. Obviously there is the theory that you should open raise much bigger from under the gun. You should make it 4x or 5x from under the gun, but you should then make it smaller from the button. Perhaps you should make it 3x or 2.5x from the button. And I was thinking about this and saying, well, in which situations can you perhaps make a min raise from early position? And I think if there are certain player types on the table, it is okay. If you have loose players in the blinds, and by loose I mean loose passive, the kind of players that are going to be calling a lot of hands pre-flop, but are then going to be stacking off with weak 1 pair hands and this kind of thing. Against these players, if they're not going to 3-bet you, you actually benefit from having a much higher stack to pot ratio, because what this means, when you have a hand like 5-6 suited, which is a speculative hand, you won't then need to hit your flush or your straight as often in order to show a profit. So theoretically, given the setup of a table, there may be times when you can even make an open min raise from under the gun, an MP, and it's just to do with the stack to pot ratio you are going to be setting up post flop. If they are loose aggressive, however, it's definitely better to make a full size raise. If there are regulars in position on you, not in the blinds, it's definitely better to make a full size raise. If the loose passive players are in position on you, this strategy can still work. For example, if there's a very loose passive player on the button, you can perhaps still open min raise, because yes, you're going to be out of position, but in some ways it doesn't matter again, because given the stack to pot ratio you're going to be setting up, you then don't need to hit a hand as often in order for it to be profitable, because when you do hit, you are going to make a lot more compared to your pre-flop investment. Looking at this table, however, it doesn't seem that there are any loose passive players on this table. The button may be slightly on the loose passive side, although perhaps not. He has been playing 36-15 over 4-6-5 hands, and he is not sitting at full stacked. But apart from this player, who may not even be passive, he may still be quite aggressive. Apart from him, there is really no reason for me to be open min raising here. It's possible, of course, I misclicked. I do not remember exactly playing this session. I was probably multi-tabling at the time. It is possible this is a misclick. Given how it works out though, and I don't mean that we flop trips, I mean given that he flats and doesn't 3-bet, it's still going to be plus EV. It's just going to be minus EV when people start 3-betting and you have to fold. Although in some ways you have to fold anyway to a 3-bet. It's just a case of, are they going to be 3-betting you more often when you open min raise rather than make it 3x or 4x. This player flats, which is the best possible scenario for us, in position with a nice stack to pot ratio, so we do have the odds to draw if we do hit a draw, which is probably the most likely hand you're going to flop with something like 6-5 suited. If you do flop a pair, it's probably not going to be good that often. It's more of a semi-bluffing type hand. We do, however, flop top trips, which is always nice. He checks to us. I definitely think it's worth putting in a bet on this board. I'd probably bet around $1. There is a flush draw out there. It's unlikely we've connected with this board. We can easily have a hand like ace-king, which we are c-betting. Not that we necessarily should be c-betting ace-king here, but he doesn't know that, and it's probably capable of maybe check-raise bluffing if he thinks we've missed this board, or he may just have a hand like an overpair type hand, like pocket 8s, pocket 10s, which he's not folding on this board. I definitely think I would put in a value bet of around $1, which is what I'd do. The turn comes an ace. It's difficult to say if this is a good or bad card. He may well have some ace-x hands in his floating range. Assuming he's not floating with an ace-x type hand, this is not a good turn card. The reason being, not because we're worried about the ace, mainly because we are now going to have more fold equity against some of his range. A hand like pocket 10s is not going to be as comfortable calling a second bet on the turn. We should definitely continue firing for value. I'd probably bet around 230 here. I'll make it 250, which is fine. We still expect to get called by some of his flush draw type hands, some of his pocket pair type hands, such as pocket 10s. It's also possible he can have some ace-x type hands himself. Perhaps he was floating the flop with a hand like ace-jack. Perhaps he has an ace-x of hearts type hand, which now has a weak top pair. Either of these hands he's probably not folding on the turn. Therefore, our value bet is a good idea. The river comes a 9, and this is unlikely to have improved his range, unless he has a hand like pocket 9s. He doesn't complete any flush or straight draws. Our plan for this river should be to fire and hope to get value from anything ranging from a hand like pocket 10s to a hand like ace-king, which floated the flop. There's no need to bet super huge here, I don't think. We definitely want him to still call if he has a hand like ace-5 of hearts. If we pot this river, he may not necessarily be calling. And he shows the ace-10, so he was in fact floating the flop with an ace-x type hand. I would expect a lot of players to be folding this type of hand a reasonable amount of the time, out of position on the flop. The reason being, yes, I know we don't necessarily hit a 6-6-3 board that often, but we are also checking back a lot of our hands that don't hit that board. So when we do c-bet, should typically look stronger, more like we have a hand like pocket 8s. It's going to be difficult for him to play a hand like ace-10 offsuit out of position. Therefore, while I don't think it's too surprising that he floats out of position on this flop, I do discount this hand from his range a percentage of the time. I don't completely discard it from his range, but this was one of the hands we were hoping to get value from. Next hand we have ace-2 suited in the big blinds. The button open raises, and the small blind calls, and it's Jojo again, who's playing 81-10. In this particular situation, assuming the small blind wasn't Jojo, this may be an okay spot to squeeze. The button is folding reasonably often to 3 bets, 77% so far over 940 hands. And also, in a standard situation, the small blind would likely 3-bet a strong hand for value himself. So we would expect to generate a reasonable amount of fold equity if we were to 3-bet squeeze here. However, against Jojo, I don't think squeezing as a bluff is going to be a good idea. In a standard situation, I don't necessarily like flatting here. It's similar situation to the 6-7 suited, I think it was, where the cutoff open raised, the button called, and we called in a small blind with 6-7 suited. Yes, it's a suited connector. It's going to play okay in multi-way pots, but not so well out of position. There's definitely a good argument for not flatting the ace-2 suited here. However, when there's a player like Jojo in the pot, it then becomes a slightly better option again to just flat. We do have a hand with potential. The downside in this situation is I'm not sure exactly what happened, but Jojo is no longer sitting deep. He is now only on $16. So this makes it slightly less plus EV to flat a speculative hand, even in position, seeing as we don't have as good implied odds as he's short stacked. I think looking back at this situation, given that we don't want to squeeze, I would probably just fold here. If Jojo was deeper stacked, if he had 100 big blinds or more, then I think calling's fine. Looking back, I'd probably fold here. Interestingly, I do decide to squeeze, which I think is okay. The only problem is I just don't think Jojo's folding often enough to make this profitable on fold equity alone. However, it is true that we are quite possibly ahead of Jojo's range and that he can call with worse, seeing as we have ace high. So perhaps it's not too terrible, it's just that our hand isn't going to be too easy to play post flop. We do end up being 4-bet by the button, and unless we have specific reads that he can 4-bet light in this spot, our standard play is going to be to fold, and we do, which is fine. The squeeze is okay. As I say, the main problem is I just think Jojo is not folding enough for it to be profitable, but he can call with worse, and the button's probably going to fold unless he has part of his value range, which apparently he did. We raise ace-9 offsuit from the cutoff. The player in the big blind makes the call. He is playing 45-18 over 24 hands. And he is not sitting full stacked. He is sitting with 80 big blinds. The flop comes 10-10-4. I think my preferred option is checking back here. Although he has been folding to c-bets, I'm not sure whether I knew this at the time. He's been c-bet twice and he's folded twice. Therefore, the EV of a c-bet perhaps goes up if he's not going to be floating on this board just because he thinks we haven't hit the 10-10-4 board. He does actually donk bet the turn after we spike our 9. I think calling here is definitely okay. There are possibly worse 9s he can do this with. When he pots the river, I think the best option is definitely to fold here. I think normally when people pot bet something, it's usually a tell that they are often very strong. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean they are strong, but rather polarized, so they're either very strong or very weak. It basically means they don't have a medium type hand. If someone is either very strong or very weak, i.e. they are polarized, but you know that they hardly ever bluff, then most of the time when they pot size here, it's going to be for value. This looks to me like it's either going to be a 10x, or at the very weakest it's going to be some type of overpair that he didn't 3-bet pre-flop. Although you'd expect this guy to maybe 3-bet a hand like jacks plus pre-flop. If he'd made this slightly smaller bet sizing, if he'd bet say 270 on the river, I'd call, because there are some busted draws. He can be semi-bluffing on the turn like a jack queen or some turn diamonds. He can also be value owning himself with a hand like jack 9, but with a weaker kicker than ours. When he pots, I don't think he has a hand like jack 9. He may have a hand like jack queen of diamonds, but I don't necessarily know whether he's capable of turning his hand into a bluff on the river. Therefore, I think his most likely holding is an overpair or stronger here. I don't think this is a 9x often enough. I think most of the time it's going to be a 10x, just because I expect him to 3-bet a hand like pocket jacks pre-flop, although not necessarily. I don't like the river call, mainly due to his bet sizing. Ace-4 suited, we raise in the cutoff, and the small blind calls, who seems to be playing a reasonably loose selection of starting hands. He is also not sitting full stacked. Flop comes king 9-2. I prefer to check back this board. I just don't think I'm getting enough folds. It's true you can sometimes be value betting here against a hand like 10 queen, 10 jack. Also, the advantage of firing c-bet is you will fold out a hand like pocket 8s most of the time. C-betting's definitely fine on this board. I think checking back is also fine, given that there are a lot of hands that can call that have good equity against us. When the turn comes the 6 of spades, I think this is a good spot to fire a second barrel. Hopefully we can get him to fold a hand like 10 jack, 10 queen, which we are still ahead of. Perhaps we can get him to fold something you floated us with, maybe a hand like pocket 10s, pocket jacks, pocket queens, maybe some 9x hands if he has them. Maybe he folds some of his flush draws. Again, we are ahead of most of his flush draws, unless they are ace-high flush draws. If he has a hand like 6-7 of clubs, we are ahead of that also. I definitely think this is a good spot to fire a second barrel, especially since we turn the 6 of spades. And it is also possible against a lot of his draws. We do actually have the best hand here. The river comes a 6 of clubs, and obviously this completes all of his flush draws. I don't think this is a good spot to fire the river. If we can assume that he's folding a lot of his one pair hands and gut shots type hands, his range ends up being weighted towards king x type hands, and occasionally some flush draws, because he's a lot more likely to continue with a flush draw than he is to continue with a hand like 10 jack, 10 queen, just because a flush draw has more equity. If his range is weighted towards king x's and flush draws, then firing the river here is not a great option. We are probably not going to get him to fold a king, and some of the time he is just going to have a flush. You can of course have some combo draws as well, like if he had 10 jack of clubs or 10 queen of clubs, and he's definitely not folding these hands on the turn. Basically, I do not think there are enough busted draws in his range to make firing a river bluff profitable. If the rivers comes bad, our plan is just to give up. And we don't even get the option to fire a third barrel on the river because he donks into us with pot. Most likely scenario is he just has a flush and he's betting for value. He puts us on an ace-king type hand maybe and thinks we can't fold to this value bet. Overall, I'm reasonably happy with how I played that hand. I definitely think you could choose not to c-bet the flop, and perhaps recently I would tend not to c-bet this king-9 deuce board with the flush draw. But c-betting is also fine. It does have some advantages, like folding out pocket eights type hands. Also, you are value betting non-intentionally against any of his draw type hands, seeing as you have ace high. Under the gun limps, and we are at a 10-0 table now. And we just check back in the big blind, which is fine. I don't think there's any reason to raise here. We more or less missed the flop. We do have a backdoor draw, but it seems pretty standard to check round here. The turn comes a king, so we pick up a flush draw, and we do also have a gut shot, although it's the lower end of a gut shot. And we hit on the river. And this player shoves. The hands we are worried about, of course, are anything higher than a 9x flush draw. So any 10x of spades, any jack x of spades, any queen x of spades. The hands we are not worried about, which he could still shove for value, is any queen, and when someone is short stacked, in general they are likely to be shoving thinner for value, seeing as they feel they are committed with slightly weaker hands. I definitely think he can therefore be shoving with a queen x here for value. May not be the best idea, but I think it's possible. He can also be shoving a worse flush that he's made on the river. These things taken into consideration, yes, sometimes we're beat here. I definitely think, given that he can easily have a queen x, our best option is to at least continue to this bet. We decide to shove, which I think is probably the best option, especially since this player behind could also call with a queen x type hand. If we flat this shove and he has a queen x, he's definitely not going to shove the money back in over the top. Whereas if we shove, he may still choose to call with his queen x. And this player does have a queen x. I'm reasonably happy with that hand. We got lucky on the river. Pocket queens, we open raise to 4x from under the gun. The button calls, who is playing 52-13, and I've given him the tag Chaser, which was a tag I was used for a while, and it typically does mean something specific. It usually means someone, in my mind, who doesn't fold a flush draw on the turn when they don't really have odds or implied odds to call. Against these players, the EV of double barreling on flush draw boards with marginal hands goes up. In this case, we have a flush draw board, and yes, he can have a king x some of the time, but if he has any draw hand, any two clubs, any 7-8, any 4-7 if he calls with that hand pre-flop, I can expect reasonably to get two streets of value out of him because he is not capable of folding these hands to a turn barrel. Oops, skip forward slightly. So we fire the flop and he calls. The turn comes a jack, which is not too much of a scare card. If he had a hand like King Jack, he obviously beats us anyway. Whereas he can definitely continue to call with any of his draws. He may even have some combo draws that he's picked up, like the 10 Queen of clubs, where he now has an open ender as well. Therefore we fire the turn. The river is obviously pretty terrible. Any 7-8 gets there, and any flush draw gets there. Quite possibly one of the worst possible rivers. Our plan is to check fold, I would imagine, and he bets $1. And this really sucks, actually. In terms of how we're doing against his range, we are pretty much beat here all the time. If you look in the top left, you will see that we are getting 5.55 to 1 odds to make this river call, and what this means is we need to be right 15% of the time for this river call to be profitable. The question is, which hands can he have that we beat, that he's betting $1 in the river with, on the river? And do we beat this part of his range 15% of the time? And I would say quite possibly the answer is no. Perhaps he could sometimes have a hand like Ace Jack that he does this with. Perhaps a hand like 7-9. He can also be doing this with King X type hands, which obviously beat us. He may be doing this with a flush, although you would definitely expect him to bet bigger on the river with a flush. He could definitely be doing this with a hand like 7-8. The river play here is very close. If you call, you're hoping he has a hand like Ace Jack that he floated with. I'm not convinced this necessarily adds up to being 15% of his range, even with hands like 7-9. Maybe even if you give him some random floats. This is a fold on the river, I think. I do decide to make the call, mainly because I felt I was being priced in to making the call, and hoping he had some random hand. Looking back at this hand, the river situation obviously sucks. I think the best option is probably to fold. And he does have the Queen 8 of clubs. It's surprising he didn't bet 2/3 pot, or maybe even pot size, given his hand. I think that may have partly factored into me looking him up here on this river, because I was discounting some of the flushes from his range, just because I expect him to bet bigger. But at the end of the day, he is a 52-13 fish. We shouldn't expect him to necessarily realize he should be betting slightly bigger on the river here with his flush type hands. He just thinks he wants to get paid off, and the smaller he bets, the more likely he is to get paid off. Being results orientated, it does go to show that my read on the flop and turn was correct, and he is not folding a flush draw if we fire 2 streets. It didn't necessarily matter that the board was king high and that it was an overpair to our hand. Everything about this hand was fine, apart from the river play, which was close, but I think is probably a fold. Okay, that's about it for today. Thanks a lot for watching, hope you enjoyed the video. This has been Weasel, making the 4th video in the Beating the Micro series. Good luck at the tables, and I'll see you guys soon.